All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this session on strategic planning. As you're coming in, make sure you have your microphones on mute. It's totally up to you whether you want to be on video or not. Just a couple of quick logistical things. This session is being recorded, as we mentioned, and it will be shared for participants. It will also be available on the Rock Rose Foundation website. Thank you all for spending time with me on a Sunday afternoon. I know it's a weekend. You have a lot you could be doing right now, spending time with family, getting caught up on chores around your house, and you've allocated this time today for some professional development. So pat yourself on the back. That's a great way to spend your Sunday afternoon. Thank you for being here. And thank you to the Rock Rose Foundation for hosting this session today. We will go ahead and get started here. From vision to action, we have 90 minutes together today. And while I would love for this to be a highly interactive session in the format that we have, in the 90-minute platform that we have, we're not going to be able to break into group sessions or do some of the stuff that I would normally like to do in an in-person workshop or training. But we're going to make heavy use of that chat box today. So as we go through the presentation today, if you have specific questions, make sure you put them in the chat box. The chat box will be monitored throughout the session today, and we have 4 planned stops, planned pauses during the session to go ahead and stop, answer any questions before moving on to the next section. So if you have questions, just please stick them in the chat. So I'm Emily Lavin, for those I don't know. I am a nonprofit management consultant. I started my consulting practice about 2 years ago, after about 18 years in the nonprofit sector. And I have held every position in the nonprofit sector, from intern to program and project management, to chief development officer, doing all the fundraising for my organization, to chief strategy officer. And for 6 years, I was a member of a 3-person executive team. So making, organizational executive management decisions, working really closely with the board of directors. And I've also served on a number of board of directors. I'm currently on the Temple Education Foundation Board of Directors, and I'm in my 4th term as president of Family Promise of Bell County. So when I come to you today, when I'm talking about strategic planning, it's from a staff perspective, having gone through this as executive management, having gone through strategic planning as a board member, and I bring, that's my background that I'm coming to you with today. There we go. And when I started this business, I really wanted to help nonprofit organizations take their businesses to the next level. And I use the word business very intentionally because nonprofits are businesses too. A lot of people don't think of nonprofits that way. A lot of people, you'll hear, interchangeably with nonprofit, charity, ministry. You'll hear that sometimes. But a nonprofit, the major difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit is that the revenues that we bring in as nonprofits go back to support our mission and support our programs. As a for-profit, you're thinking about maximizing the income for your owner and your shareholders. That's not the case for a nonprofit. We can still make money, and we do need to make money. We need to make money to be able to have a talented staff, to have high-performing boards. We have to have the financial resources to fulfill our mission and run impactful programs. And as a nonprofit, as a business, we have to think about strategy to drive decision making. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we have a few learning objectives for this session today. We're going to talk about the 5 phases of the strategic planning process, which are around strategic planning readiness, getting ready to plan, understanding your operating environment, right? Because no organization exists in a vacuum. Establishing your purpose and direction. And then once you get there and you have your vision, how do you put that into action? How do you implement that? And then how do you evaluate and monitor your progress? So, Solange, can you go ahead and launch that poll? Our first poll. All right. So if everybody could just answer this question, how frequently do you think an organization should engage in strategic planning? Should you do it annually, every 3 years, or every 5 years? All right, we'll wrap it up in just about 10 seconds here. And then Solange, if you can just share those results. All right, annually, a lot of people think every 3 years, 21%, and every 5 years, 0%. The answer is actually every 3 years. And here's why. Mm. Ah, because you want to be proactive rather than reactive. In 5 years, if you were to wait every 5 years to do a strategic plan, and you know what, this used to be the industry standard. It used to be every 5 years an organization would go through strategic planning, but a lot can happen in 5 years, right? Like we could have a global pandemic. You could have a major economic downturn that impacts your business. While you want to do some level of planning annually, typically in your annual operating plan, a strategic plan is more comprehensive in nature, and it would be really time consuming to do it every year. So you want to plan for something that's usually in the 3 year range. And rather than being super granular about every single thing that you're going to accomplish and all of the tasks, a strategic plan should have a decision-making framework so that you can be nimble and be proactive rather than reacting to things that come your way. Some of the other reasons you want to plan are to build a shared sense of responsibility for what happens within your organizations, between and among staff, among program folks, within the community. You're building this shared sense of responsibility. You want to increase operational efficiency among leadership. And so that strategic plan is going to provide you with a roadmap that helps you align your goals and then your programs and activities. So what are you doing on a daily basis that is in line with the goals and the intentions that you've created through the strategic planning process? And then going through the process of strategic planning, you have to be really honest, right? You have to answer a lot of hard questions. You've got to work together. And that really helps to manage the expectations and bolster trust among and between your board and staff. So there are essentially 5 phases of strategic planning. And this comes, and sort of this framework for this presentation and these 5 phases come directly from BoardSource. Write it down, BoardSource. BoardSource is the go-to really for board governance, board development, really any sort of organizational development practices. They have a lot of material and articles for free on their website, and they also have a program where nonprofits can go through sort of a board governance training and get access. It's a paid membership that gives you access to greater materials. But they do have a lot of great resources for free, so I would encourage you to check them out. The 5 phases of strategic planning are planning to plan, understanding the context. After you kind of understand your operating environment in which you work, you want to agree on where are we headed, what's our purpose, what's our direction. Then we're going to be talking about moving from vision to action. So we know where we want to be, but how do we develop an action plan and some associated tasks and goals and responsibilities? And then monitoring progress. You don't want your plan to just sit on a shelf. You want to make sure on a regular basis that you're referring back to it. How are we integrating these priorities into the day to day? So before you start planning, we have a few questions to consider. Is our organization really ready for strategic planning? What are we hoping to accomplish through this process? Do we have programmatic goals? Do we have operational goals? Do we have fundraising goals? Like, what is it that we really want to get out of this process? How do we facilitate the process? Are we going to hire somebody to do this for us? Can we do this internally? Do we have the right people on board to be able to do this internally? Who are we going to include in the process? So you'll want to have a strategic planning committee. And depending on how big your organization is, that committee may be your entire board. If you have a 4-person board, a 5-person board, you're going to want to involve everybody in that process. If you're a larger organization with a 12 or 13-person board and 5 or 6 or even 10 staff members, your strategic planning committee is going to look a little bit different because you can be a little more strategic about who goes on the strategic planning committee. And then you also want to consider what kind of human and financial resources that you need. Who needs to show up to the table every time we're talking? What's it going to cost to be able to get through this strategic planning process? So this is just an example of a readiness checklist. And let me first say, I know a number of organizations on this call today are new organizations and may not be able to answer yes to all or even half of these questions. And that's okay. My hope is that through this session today, through this workshop, you're able to take away, even if you're not ready to engage in a full-blown strategic planning process, some good tools and resources to be able to think more strategically. So I just say that don't worry, don't fret if you can't check yes to all of these things. You can still start to think strategically. But you want to make sure that you have commitment and involvement from top leadership, whether that's your executive director, your board chair. Obviously, if they're not on board with going through a strategic planning process, it's really going to be a moot point because you have to have that buy-in from the top. You need to have a willingness and ability to gather information about your organization and the community. You have to understand who you're serving, how you're serving them, if you're effective, what other folks in the community think about what you're doing, where the need is so that you understand how to better position your programs. And you don't have to go into the process knowing all those things, but you have to be willing and able to get that information. You want to have the right mix of individuals on your planning committee. Again, your planning committee is going to look different depending on what your organization looks like. But you want to make sure that your committee has a good mix of strategic thinkers and doers. So folks who can think about the picture, big picture, but also folks who know how to roll up their sleeves and get stuff done. Willingness to be inclusive and encourage broad participation. You want to engage all staff and board members at some level. Even if they're not on the strategic planning committee, you want to make sure all voices are heard, and you have to have a willingness to engage everybody who is relevant to that strategic planning process. You need to have an adequate commitment of resources to complete the process, to go all the way through the planning process. It can take months to go through a really effective planning process. People get burned out. So you need to know that you have people who are willing to commit that time to the process and that you have some financial resources to commit to the process. Because even if you do it internally, you're going to be taking staff time. And once that strategic plan is complete, you have to be able to implement some of the priorities that you've identified. You have to have some clarity on your desired outcomes and the issues to be addressed, which is different than saying you know what the goals and outcomes are going to be at the end of the process. Certainly we don't know that going into it, though we might have an idea of what we want to see. We need to have an idea of what our specific challenges are so that we know which challenges we need solved at the end of the process. You have to have a willingness to question the status quo, ask the hard questions, and support change. And this is particularly important for organizations who are longer term organizations who have been in business for a while, who have maybe gone through other iterations of this. Maybe you've been implementing the same programs for 20 years, and it's time to step back and say, hey, how has our community changed since we started these programs? How has the need changed? How have we changed as an agency? What other organizations exist out there that maybe didn't exist out there previously? And those questions can be kind of hard because the answer to those questions might be, we need to make some really dramatic changes. And you have to have a willingness going into this process to make those dramatic changes. And then, of course, you don't want to have any other separate planning processes underway, such as a merger or a strategic partnership, when you're considering doing your own strategic planning. And you have to have a commitment to allocating the resources that actually support the strategy implementation. So when you figure out what your priorities are and what you want to do, how do you get there? You don't have to have all the financial resources now, but you have to say, okay, we're going to figure out how to get these things accomplished once we know what we want to do. So, what do we hope to accomplish? You want to establish, at a very minimum, every single one of you is going to want to establish some clear goals and priorities to guide your decision making at all levels. But you also want to be specific to your organization and field. So, for example, we need a plan to continue to serve low and moderate income first-time home buyers as home prices and interest rates increase. This is taken directly from an organization I used to work for. We did housing counseling and education for first-time home buyers. Obviously, as home prices started to increase, interest rates started to increase, a lot of folks found that they could no longer afford to purchase their home. And so that was affecting how many clients we were able to serve. And that organization decided to add another program, a low interest down payment and closing cost assistance loan, to help those folks to become first-time home buyers. That was an extension of the mission of the organization. Other questions you might be asking that are specific to your organization or field might be, hey, we hired our first executive director, and now we need to figure out what our staffing structure is going to look like to meet our programmatic goals. Or we need to understand our specific niche within our sector. So where can we best partner with others to meet community need, and where do we need to build new programs? That's actually a really important one. I think a lot of folks struggle with this. Sometimes there's an oversaturation of services in your sector, and especially when organizations are starting out, when you see the need, there is kind of a tendency to say, oh man, let's try all these different programs because the need is there, and we need to have a food pantry and we need to have a clothing closet. When in reality, there might be other organizations in your sector and in your community who are already doing that really well. And you want to find ways to align and partner rather than duplicate services. So what can you expect? This is at a minimum. If you're going into a strategic planning process, you want to develop or substantiate your current mission, vision, and value statements. You want to identify 1 to 5 pillars or focus areas. You're going to develop within each of those focus areas 2 to 4 goals for each. And then you want to develop an action plan that has identified tasks and goals. And no matter how you go through this strategic planning process, this is kind of what it's going to look like at the end. I want to show you a few examples. And I kind of struggled as I was putting this presentation together with whether to put the examples toward the end or whether to put them toward the beginning. But I think it's really helpful to get an idea of what this looks like at the end of the process. So when I tell you what I'm talking about, when I say you want to develop or substantiate 1 to 5 strategic goals or pillars, what do I mean by that? So here's an example specifically of those pillars. This is from the World YMCA, and they've sort of organized all of their goals and strategies into these four areas. Community well-being, which I assume would include like the gyms and the youth programming and all the things that they do in that space. Meaningful work, so around workforce development, sustainable livelihoods, sustainable planet, around climate justice and sustainability, and a just world. And kind of their goals are going to be organized under each of those pillars based on what their priorities are as an agency. This is one from the Corporation for Supportive Housing. So they've sort of aligned their focus areas in three key areas: housing, services, and economic security. They're going to have a number of goals and initiatives that fall within each of those areas. And they've identified a focus on equity, centering people and communities, and promoting quality in their services as sort of the things that they want to align everything around. So they're going to consider each of those drivers as they're developing goals around housing, services, and economic security. This is from the Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Atlanta. They have two programmatic goals: serving more kids more often, achieving greater impact with kids. So this first one's probably going to be more like, how do we get those kids into our programs in the first place? How are we going to do that? And they're going to have goals around getting those kids into the programs. Number two, around achieving greater impact with the kids. That might be developing new programs that go deeper, that provide higher quality or maybe more touch points with those kids. What does that impact look like? Then they have a few goals that are not programmatic: realizing a strong financial position. This was important enough to them that they've made that financial position an area of focus. So they may have some goals under there relating to accounting, related to fundraising, how they're going to be in the best financial position that they can be as an organization to fulfill the priorities and the goals that they have. Building diverse and effective leaders. There's probably some HR goals under here. How do we, maybe some policies, some diversity policies? How do we maybe create a leadership program? And then promoting equity and inclusion. That might be some communications and marketing goals under there. How do we promote? How do we enhance this? And then the final example I have is from Catholic Charities from the Archdiocese of Galveston. They've basically organized their goals around clients, staff, and communities. So they have goals around improving client service, ensuring that their facilities are a place that offer respect and dignity of those that they serve. Having evidence-based research that drives their client model, ensuring that they have a comprehensive program review, and increasing those quality of client interactions. They also have some goals around staff, promoting a culture of excellence. They want to attract and retain talented staff. They want to have a great recruitment process, outreach process. They want to be able to offer competitive wages. And again, their facilities have to serve their staff, not only their clients. And then finally, they have a bucket of goals around community. So how are they going to educate the community so that they can reduce barriers for their clients? How do they broaden their base of community support? And then how do they increase their revenue to do the work that they need to do? So those are just a few examples of how some well-known organizations have organized their pillars or their highest level goals. Just a couple of things in this first phase before we move on to our next to our pause for questions. Just want to mention that you do have to identify stakeholders and their roles. So we talked a little bit about having a strategic planning committee and who is on that. It's helpful to know who you want to be involved in your strategic planning process and at what level. Your executive director and your board president are almost always, regardless of the structure or size of your organization, going to have full participation on your planning committee. You need them to have a really high level of engagement. If you know you have a lot of like organizational goals, there are things around policy creation, bylaw review, you might want to have your governance chair have a really high level of participation should you have a governance chair, right? If you're a smaller organization, it may be all board members have to have a high level of participation because we have very limited staff or no staff or all volunteer staff, and we have our board of directors, and we really need everybody to be all on board to be able to do this. You might even have stakeholders who have roles, and those stakeholders are outside of your organization. So there might be folks who serve on your committees that you want to engage in the process. If you have staff, you might want to engage them to varying degrees. If you have a program director, they probably need to be really involved because clearly anything that you decide in the programmatic space is something that they're going to be responsible for implementing. So you always want to think, who is going to be responsible for implementing or for helping to drive some of this change and making sure that they have high participation in the process. And then facilitating the process. There are a couple of ways to go about this. So basically, you can do have a consultant facilitate your process, or you can do it internally. And people ask me all the time, can I do this internally? Yes, you absolutely can. I'm going to give you like one side of things and then the other side of things. If you have a consultant facilitated comprehensive strategic planning process, this is going to be the most time intensive and the most financially intensive. You could pay anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000 for a comprehensive strategic planning process that would involve multiple facilitated sessions, stakeholder interviews and focus groups, a really comprehensive market and best practice research. And when I say comprehensive market analysis, I mean somebody's going to go out and have stakeholder interviews. They're going to conduct multiple focus groups. They're going to do some really strategic demographic analysis and understand exactly where your organization is within the context of all the other community organizations in your area. So that's one side of things, and probably not a side of things that anybody on this call today can afford. On the other side is an internally facilitated process. This is something you can do yourselves in 1 or 2 or even 3 board meetings. Maybe you want to call a special meeting and have a board retreat. And you want those to be focused on your mission, vision, and values, ensuring that those statements are articulated and are driving the work of your organization. You want to identify your top priorities within those sessions. And then you'll probably have some ongoing work in committees to do that action planning. The key with an internally facilitated strategic planning process, or the challenge within an internally facilitated strategic planning process, is ensuring that all voices are heard. Sometimes what happens if the board chair or the executive director is driving that strategic planning process, the other folks who are engaged in that tend to be deferential to that leadership position. So you need to have somebody who can sort of facilitate that process in a way that makes everybody feel engaged. So if you have a skilled facilitator on your board or on your staff, that you can utilize, that's maybe not going to cause that power dynamic to be an issue, that would be ideal. Another way is to work with a consultant, but not go all out and do that full-blown comprehensive strategic planning process. Kind of work with that consultant to get exactly what you need from the process. probably do a board retreat, a couple of facilitated sessions. That consultant can be there if you need them to be to help with that ongoing implementation work. And that can cost anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000, depending on how much you want to continue to engage that consultant after the initial board retreat. The internally facilitated strategic plan, I will point out, it's clearly the cheapest of all options. Your only cost is going to be staff time. And you do have to take that into consideration because anytime that you have a staff person driving that process, that's taking that person away from the other programmatic things that they would typically be doing for the organization. All right. So I think with that, I know that's a lot, but we can pause here. And if there are any questions, I know Kelsey has been monitoring the chat.
We actually don't have any questions that have been submitted yet. So if anyone has any and they would like to pop them in the chat, I can make sure to share them. If you don't have any now, that's okay. We can do it in the next section as you think of them.
And does anybody want to pop off mute for a second and ask a question if you have it? That's totally fine. I know y'all are giving up your Sunday afternoon, so I want to make sure you get the most out of this. But if there are no questions, I'll continue. And if you have more questions, just pop them in the chat when you're ready, and we'll address them in the next section. All right. So one of the things that I mentioned is that we have to understand the context. And this is the next phase of the strategic planning process, is understanding the context. No organization exists in a vacuum. There are a number of external and internal forces that shape the work that we do. So I'm curious if you could just pop them in the chat box. Can anybody think of some external forces or external factors that impact our organizations? And Kelsey, if you see anything in the chat box, if you could just read it out.
Economy, the community.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Politics.
Yes.
Climate and cultural climate, inflation, COVID, disposable income, weather, funding source, duplication of services, time.
Did anybody see my presentation in advance? Yes, so all of those things, right? Those are external factors. Your strategic partners, who you work with, those are external factors. Your competitors, similar organizations who are doing the same thing in the market. You know, we talked about there could be duplication of services or overextension of services. You're also competing for the same money and the same resources. Your funding environment is a huge external factor. For many years, I was blessed to work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which has, an amazing philanthropic environment because of all the industrialists that set up foundations there, the Heinz and the Carnegies and the Mellons. And so, man, if you're in Pittsburgh, you're getting a ton of foundation funding. When I came down to Central Texas, and I was like, where are all the funders? Where are all the funders? There's just not the same philanthropic environment here. There are 3 major foundations in Waco. In Bell County, Rock Rose Foundation is, to my knowledge, the only organization that's giving out competitive grants. There are a few large corporations that give grants. Your funding environment, though, is not just your philanthropic environment. It's not just your community. If you're a healthcare organization. You may get funding through the state. You may have federal grants that you have access to. There may be large national foundations that you have access to that are within your sector. So your funding environment, the economy, obviously your local economy. If you've had a major employer leave your area, there may be higher poverty and a higher demand for your services. Um, your global economy, clearly, if you have higher interest rates, if you're having inflation, these things are going to impact your organization. They're going to impact your clients. They're going to impact the need for your services. The political and legal climate, the landscape. Clearly, it's probably a lot easier to operate a women's clinic in New York than in Texas. The media. Maybe you're so lucky and you have a great relationship with the local media and they're giving your organization a ton of attention. That's going to work out really well for you. But there can also be situations, and we probably all can think of examples of this, when a similar organization to yours has mismanaged funds and that organization is now in the news, and so it's impacting your organization. Technological changes. Again, this isn't one we always think about, but it's one that can be really that can impact your organization. Maybe you're an organization that is connecting low-income teens with laptops or something, and you need to be aware of what's happening in the environment. And the natural environment, climate change, not just for those organizations who are involved in climate change, who are environmental nonprofit, but I mean, if you're in Texas, chances are your insurance rates have gone up in recent years, thanks to all the number of natural disasters that we've had. So clearly, all of these things have an impact on your organization. And when you think about your strategic planning, you have to consider all these external factors. You also have to consider your internal factors, your staff capacity, your staff structure, your board capacity. What kind of board do you have? Do you have a large board? Do you have a small board? Do you have the right people on there to implement your programs? Do you have the right mix of expertise and skills and experience and perspectives? What does your organizational culture look like? What financial or accounting systems do you have? Do you use QuickBooks? Do you have a bookkeeper? Are you doing everything on spreadsheets? Like all of that stuff are things that you have to consider going into the strategic planning process. What are your current mission, vision, and values? Those may change in the strategic planning process, but that's an internal factor. Your programs, what are your existing programs? What does the staffing for those programs look like? What's your client base? What are your financial resources? Are you primarily grant funded? Do you have a lot of individual donors? Are you really reliant on one particular resource that could go away? What does your physical environment look like? Do your facilities work for your organization? And then tools and technology. Do you have a customer relationship management system? Does everybody in your organization have their own laptop? Do you need, SMS messaging to be able to reach your clients? So all of these things, your internal factors, your external factors, this is the context in which your organization operates on a day-to-day basis. And it's important to understand that context as you go into your SWOT analysis, where you're going to look at your organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And when I do a SWOT analysis, as you can see here, this is from a retreat I did with the Belton Educational Foundation. I like to take these big sheets of flip chart paper and write at the top of it strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and lay them out next to each other and go through the exercise and have everybody identify and keep this slide up. When you're going through the SWOT analysis, keep up this list of your external factors and your internal factors so that as you're going through and identifying those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, you're thinking, okay, yeah, well, what is the media? How does the media impact my organization? Is that a threat? Is that an opportunity? Is our staff structure, is that a strength or is that a weakness? And typically what you'll do is when you identify a strength, you simultaneously identify a weakness, and vice versa. When you identify a threat, you can simultaneously identify an opportunity. Um, so it's nice to have everything up there at once because you're going to be going back and forth between those boards and identifying, a lot of stuff in each category. So another thing that will inform this process and help you understand your context is looking at some specific data that's available to you. So if there are community plans or studies about your industry or your sector um, that exist that you can reference, that's helpful going into your goals and your goal setting. Are there housing or health needs assessments? Maybe there's a point in time study that you can reference around like how many homeless people are there at any given time in your community. If you utilize client surveys or feedback, this is a really good practice if you are a direct service organization to have client surveys, whether it's exit surveys, so that you can assess how well you're doing and how well you're serving those clients. Stakeholder surveys, interviews, and focus groups. Again, we talked about how if you utilize a consultant, they might be able to set up some really specific focus groups. They might call 10 funders and interview them and want to find out why you work with this, why you funded this organization, or why you didn't. But you can do that yourself. You might not be able to do it to a huge extent that maybe working with a large firm would allow you to do, but you can call up other folks within your sector, partner organizations, or even competing organizations. You can call up previous funders and talk to them about what they think is working well in your organization, particularly with funders. If they didn't fund you, why didn't they fund you? And I know the Rock Rose Foundation does a really good job of providing that type of feedback to all of their applicants if they ask. Demographic data, get familiar with the census. The census is a great place to understand what's going on in your community, to look at trends over time, to say, hey, if you're a organization that serves children and families, and you have a youth demographic that's growing in your area, particularly an underserved youth demographic, that's helpful for you to know. If you're an organization focused on aging in place and people in your area are aging at you're having more and more older folks over the last few years, like, again, these things are helpful to know. If the poverty rate is increasing, that's going to impact who is utilizing your services. So as you go through it, you're going to be asking your contextual questions. What does our ecosystem look like? Who's doing similar work? And what is their niche? And how does that impact what we should be doing, right? If everybody is doing something similar, how do we carve out where we are best positioned to work in the community to serve that population? How's our organization perceived within that community or ecosystem? You want to look at, what does your leadership look like? Have we recently had a change at the board or staff level? How's our programming evolved since the organization was founded? Is it still serving us? Is it based on what we know about community need and how the demographics in our community are evolving, what the challenges are? Is our programming still meeting the needs of the community? And do we have the resources that we need to fulfill our mission? All of these questions are really important to ask yourself as you move into the next phase, which is agreeing on purpose and direction. So I'm going to pause there for a minute and see if there are any questions that have come up in this last section.
Yeah, we had one that came in that is, what is the best way to introduce strategic planning to a group of separate organizations?
As in wanting to partner with that organization to do strategic planning together? Whoever asked that question, feel free to either clarify in the chat or to come off mute.
Yes, that is the question.
So bringing in two organizations to do strategic planning together. That's a good question. I think that you have to think about your own organization, right? When you're going about strategic planning. Usually if there's sometimes if there's a top-down approach, like for example, if you're in a community where both organizations are funded by the same funder, this is where I've seen this to be the most effective, is if a funder basically says, hey, we want to fund both of your organizations, but what you're doing is really similar. We want to get you guys together to kind of iron out what you're doing and that's similar, where you excel, how you can kind of figure out what your niche is within the sector. A lot of times when it's top down, that works. Um, but oftentimes, even if you're not working with another organization to come up with your own strategic plan together, when you're doing your organizational strategic plan, you can still talk to other organizations within your sector who are doing something similar. And you can do that without having a consultant facilitate that process for you. If a consultant facilitates that process for you, they're probably going to put together a focus group, right? That's going to be all of the homeless services organizations in an area, all of the health services organizations in an area, whatever your sort of niche is, or whatever your sort of sector is, and kind of iron those things out, ask some really specific questions. But you can also organize that on your own. You might want to just get together with a few other nonprofit leaders who you know have similar organizations and find out how things are going with them and do something that's really more informal. So, what programs are you finding to be really successful? What does your client base look like? What are the other challenges that they have? And carve out a couple of hours to have that conversation among industry leaders. And then you can all leave from that conversation having fulfilled part of the research of the context in your own strategic planning initiatives. If that's so, hopefully that's helpful. Anything else, Kelsey?
Not right now. I'll let you know in the next section.
All right. Um, so agreeing on purpose and direction. Now that we have gone through the SWOT analysis, we've better understood our context, we've done our data and research, we've talked to similar organizations. We need to agree on what our purpose and direction is as a strategic planning committee, as a board of directors. So the first thing we're going to do is review our mission, vision, and value statements. If we're a brand new organization, we're coming up with those mission, vision, and value statements. These are the things that are going to drive the way our organization works, the things that we do, the programs that we have, the partnerships that we build, the way we show up in our communities is when we have our mission and vision and value statements. So you're going to go through a visioning exercise that will, either substantiate existing or create new statements. You're going to say, why does our organization exist? What will our community look like if we're successful? What values do we share? So we're going to do a quick poll. Solange, if you can launch that one. What do you think is the best definition of an organization's vision? Its purpose, motivations, and actions to reach its goal, the big picture goal of what an organization wants to achieve, or the ethical guidelines and standards that direct an organization's action. All right, we'll give that just a few more seconds, and then if you want to share those results. All right. 33% thought it was our organization's missions, motivations and actions to reach the goal. 62% big picture goal, and then 5% the ethical guidelines and standards. So let's look Our vision is the big picture of what you want to achieve. So, for example, no child in the county will go hungry. And the vision is going to describe a future state in which your goals have been accomplished. Your mission, on the other hand, is going to describe how you're going to achieve that vision. So it's your purpose, your motivations, and your actions to reach that big picture goal. It should describe why your organization exists, who you serve, and what you aspire to accomplish. So usually it'll say, we do XYZ by doing XYZ because, but you want to be concise. Your mission should really strive to be concise. You want to be able to recite your mission without having to reference it as part of your elevator pitch. And then lastly, your values are your ethical guidelines and standards that direct all your action. They're going to guide those individual behaviors. So this is how you want to show up in your community and at your job every day. We're going to look at a couple of examples. Here's some mission examples from well-known organizations. So the American Red Cross prevents and alleviates human suffering in the face of emergencies by, this is how we do it, right? Mobilizing the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. So we know what they do, we know how they do it. Susan G. Komen, our mission is to save lives by meeting the most critical needs in our communities and investing in breakthrough research to prevent and cure breast cancer. So they want to save lives. They do it by investing in that research to prevent and cure breast cancer. Boys and Girls Clubs of America, they exist to enable all young people, especially those who need us most. And again, defining who your population is, your client population, to reach their full potential as productive, caring, responsible citizens. This is from one of my clients, Temple Community Clinic. I did not help them with this mission and vision. They came up with that before I started working with them. But you can see their vision is to be recognized throughout Bell County as a comprehensive resource for health services that will provide improved access to healthcare and wellness education for qualified individuals to ensure optimal health and well-being. The mission is very clear and succinct. They're committed to providing quality medical services and health and wellness education. And they do those two things. And I'll just put a plug for streamlining your mission and streamlining your services. Temple Community Clinic is very, very clear on who they serve, what programs they offer, who they don't serve. They provide the quality medical services and they provide health and wellness education. And that is it. And they only serve people 18 to 65 because those above 65 are better served by Medicare and those under 18 are better served by the Children's Health Insurance Program. So through this process and through, developing your vision and your mission, you really want to be clear on what you're doing, what you're not doing, who your service population is, who you are targeting through your services. And then lastly, Habitat for Humanity. Again, such a simple vision, and I love this one. A world where everyone has a decent place to live. Like that's super big picture, right? And then how do we do it? Their mission is they're seeking to put God's love into action. That's what drives them. Habitat for Humanity brings people together because that's a huge piece of Habitat, right? Is bringing people together in that owner builder model. They build homes, communities, and hope. And then they have their principles, which are like their values, to demonstrate the love of Jesus Christ, to focus on shelter, advocating for affordable housing, promoting dignity and hope. And again, that's part of that owner builder model, right? Is really bringing that dignity. And then supporting sustainable and transformative development. All right, so that's just some examples of your mission, vision, and values. Any more questions come in that section, Kelsey?
We had one question that says, when presenting your business, Should your mission be the specific part of your pitch?
Your mission should be very clear, concise, and should let people know exactly what you do. Um, but it should still be compelling, right? So it's the more specific piece. If you go back here, for example, your vision is so much more nebulous, like, well, if you will. It's everyone has a decent place to live, but how do you do that? When you're articulating your mission, you want stakeholders and funders to understand why you're doing what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and how you're doing it. But you don't want your mission to be more than a sentence or two max, but something that you can recite very easily and that has those 3 points. So once you've figured out what your mission is, your vision, your values, how do you move from there into action? So you're going to identify 4 to 7 priorities or areas of focus in order to achieve that vision. I think 3 to 5 is actually good. I've seen some plans where people have 8 high-level goals, and it's just a lot to achieve. But those priorities or those buckets or those pillars, whatever you want to call them, and you will see them called everything, depending on what type of plan you're referencing. Those priorities are informed by that SWOT analysis. So you've identified what all the context is, what you have to think about. You've identified what your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats are. And a lot of times that opportunities section is a really good place to start forming your goals and priorities. And from there, you want to set your SMART goals. Does anybody know what SMART stands for? You can put it in the chat box if you do. I'm going to come off the, can I see the chat box? Oh, there we go. I can actually see the chat box. Anybody know what SMART goals stand for? Yes, specific, measurable, achievable. Yes, 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 yes. And there's several different versions of this. I say specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time bound. Goals may be programmatic or operational in nature. So we talked about, there was the example, I think it was the Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Atlanta, where they actually had a specific goal or pillar around financial sustainability. You may have some that are specific to organizational capacity, but you also will probably have at least 1 or 2 pillars that are very programmatic in nature, that get to the root of what you're doing, serving the homeless in your community, serving the hungry in your community, providing free healthcare to folks in your community. What does that look like? Sorry, guys. Okay, so here's sort of a template of what this can look like. And I apologize. Oh, wait, actually, great. I thought that these logos were cut off, but they're not. You have your organization, you have your mission statement, you've clearly organized each of your goals and your objectives. And then within that, you want to identify those specific initiatives or tasks. So this is an example from NeighborWorks, Western Pennsylvania, where I worked for 10 years, and I worked on this strategic plan as a staff person. We worked with a consultant who facilitated a comprehensive strategic planning process for us. And the vision, we'll start with the vision. We envision neighborhoods in which everyone has the tools and assets to build and sustain their financial future. So what does that mean? We're working to promote stable, vibrant communities by providing our neighbors with these 2 services: comprehensive financial empowerment and home ownership services. And then you can see here, we identified these 4 values that drive all the work that we do. Integrity. And for us, that means promoting an environment of transparency, accountability, inclusion, and honesty. Collaboration, seeking locally driven solutions with our neighbors and partners in public and private sector. We want to collaborate, right? Like, we're trying to work within our ecosystem, not just do our thing and try to compete with others. We want to make sure that we are working together toward a common goal. Empowerment. Um, this is an organization that's working to help folks to achieve self-sufficiency through education and wealth building. It's a hand up, right? It's not a handout. We're letting folks achieve that self-sufficiency. And then quality. The work that we do is going to be measurable. We're going to have lasting outcomes that's built on our history and our impact. Then moving into this vision section, getting things into action, this is what our goals looked like. We have 4 buckets or pillars around championing homeownership, supporting financial empowerment, demonstrating impact, and enhancing capacity. And you can see within these, there's sort of a statement about what that means, what our goal is within each area. And then within each of those goals, some specific objectives, improving and expanding the reach of services, the way we're focusing on our programs, how we partner with organizations, focusing those resources in the communities that are best positioned to benefit from those services. There's more programmatic goals, and then there's goals specifically around demonstrating impact. These are the marketing and communications goals. How are folks in the community going to know about your services? And then finally, a pillar around enhancing capacity. So this is all the pieces that we know we need to improve organizationally to be able to achieve those programmatic goals. So obtaining tools and technology and infrastructure that we need, improving our employment value proposition so that we can attract and retain qualified staff, ensuring processes and practices promote optimal operations, and aligning our governance practices with strategic goals. So this is, and I'd love to have a strategic plan that's just like this. You can have a strategic plan that has, many pages after this that sort of break out each of these things, and we'll look at what an action plan looks like. But at a minimum, having a comprehensive overview that's just like this, has your mission, vision, values, your pillars or your buckets, and then your objectives within each one of those, is a really great comprehensive overview that you can share on your website. You can share with funders if you're going to a meeting with a new partner. Hey, here's our sort of one-page overview of our strategic plan. This is what we're about. This is what we want to hope to accomplish. Once you've identified some of the things you want to accomplish, what your priorities are, you need to look at your infrastructure within your organization. Are you organized to do the work that you've identified as your priorities? What functions, whether they're financial, programmatic, resource development, communications, admin support, what do we have currently? And does that current infrastructure enable us to achieve those priorities? Or do we need to hire more staff, rethink our staff structure, rethink our board structure? Do we have the right skills, knowledge? Do we have the right diversity on our board to be able to achieve these priorities? What functions are missing? Are there functions we no longer need? Whether that's programmatic, whether that's technology, is that a staff function that we have that we don't need anymore? I worked for an organization that had a marketing position, and we realized, like, what, we don't really need this marketing position, and we're paying $60,000 a year for something that can maybe be integrated into these other positions. So doing that kind of infrastructure assessment, you also want to ask if there's anything that's no longer serving you. And then thinking about kind of your gap analysis, you know where you want to be, you know what your goals are, but what do you need to get to those goals? So again, those finance and accounting systems, for example, what revenue might you need? What income do you need? What are the funding sources that you can get that from? Do you need space or equipment that you don't have right now? Is your current facility serving you? Do you have a board and committee structure that's working for you? Do you need new procedures, more policies? Do you need to revise your bylaws in accordance with this strategic plan? And then importantly, what programs and services Do you need to either launch to serve the community? Do you need to scale back on? Is there anything that you maybe need to offload to another organization who might be better positioned to absorb that service? So all important questions to ask as you're going into our action planning phase. So as you move into action planning, we've talked about for each priority area, you want to set your SMART goals. You want to establish 2 to 4 goals or objectives for each priority area, as in the NeighborWorks example that we looked at. And you want to establish ownership for each objective. That could be an individual, right? That could be like our development officer is going to figure out this development planning stuff, fundraising stuff. Or maybe you have a resource development committee that's going to be responsible for that. You want to set a general timeline for each objective or task. And you shouldn't expect to complete action planning in a single meeting. Specific steps and timelines are probably going to be established in subsequent meetings, but you want to have a good start. So one of the things, and you can do it a couple of ways, right? Maybe you go through this process, you do your SWOT analysis, you have identified your areas of strength, you've identified potential opportunities. I like to just take, again, those big flip charts and be like, hey, what are our high level priorities? And just write them all up there. And maybe you have 15 priorities and then work to get those priorities organized into pillars or buckets, right? And a lot of times it starts to make sense. Is this a programmatic priority? Is it an operational priority? And from those, you can start to build those 3 to 4 priority areas or pillars based on what the identified priorities are. You can also do it the other way around, right? You might be able to look at your SWOT analysis and everything you've discussed and identify right off the bat 3 or 4 pillars, and then you can start to identify what the priorities are within each pillar. It's whatever works the best with how your brain works. I like to do it the other way around. I like to put everything up there, all the priorities, 15 to 20 priorities, try to synthesize those down into 12, 10 to 15 priorities, and then put them into the buckets or pillars. This is just an example of what an action planning template could look like. So you want to define your priority here. What is that pillar, right? Within that, what is the objective? As you saw in the NeighborWorks example, within that championing homeownership section, there were 4 different objectives. So for objective 1, what are your specific tasks? For objective 2, what are your specific tasks? Who's going to complete those tasks and by when? So here's an example. And this is, much like in that Boys and Girls Club example, in this hypothetical organization, the priority is to increase financial sustainability by growing resources to fulfill the mission. So what are we going to do? Within that, we've identified a couple of objectives, and there may be more objectives than this. I just kind of put this together as a hypothetical. But objective 1, cultivate and grow individual giving by 25%. So how are we going to do that? We're going to develop a monthly donor program. We're going to meet with our top 25 current donors and see if we can move them to a higher level of giving. And we're going to develop a signature fundraising event. So you look at these are all things we want to do, but we can't do them all at once. Who's gonna be responsible for making sure this stuff gets done? Well, Anita, maybe she's our development officer, she's going to make sure that this gets done. She's going to develop that monthly donor program. When is she going to do it? By the end of the second quarter. We're going to meet with the top 25 current donors. That may take a while, right? Like we got to get on everybody's calendar, and you can assume that these top 25 current donors are probably pretty busy, so it might take a while to get on their calendars. So let's go till the end of Q3 for that. Developing a signature fundraising event. We already kind of know what we're going to do with fundraising this year. Let's make that a top priority for Q1 of 2026. Right? Because you're looking at the next 3 years. Objective 2, increasing philanthropic funding by 30%. So maybe to do that, if we want to increase our philanthropic funding, maybe we need to hire a contract grant writer. That might be goal, objective number 1, hire a contract grant writer. We're going to do that by Q1. We're going to meet with 3 local foundations. Again, we want to get that done right at the beginning of the year. And Seth, who's going to hire the grant writer, he's going to introduce that grant writer to these foundations, right? So the purpose here with the action planning example is these are not super detailed, right? Like develop a monthly donor program. But you really don't want something that is too detailed within your action plan. Because like we talked about, anything can happen in that 3-year period. And your action plan should really be more of a decision-making framework than something that gets down to every little detail. Now, you can utilize this action plan and within that develop a monthly donor program and the meeting with the top 25 current donors. You can ask Anita, who is responsible for that, to give you more of a detailed outline of how she's going to do that. And as an executive director, you can build that into Anita's work plan. But within the context of the strategic plan, the action plan, we don't need to get down to the nitty gritty of exactly what that monthly donor program is going to look like. I want to briefly mention the roles of committees because they can be really integral in kind of fleshing out that action plan and determining your tasks, timelines, and responsibilities. Common committees that a lot of organizations have are communications and marketing, resource development or fundraising, governance, programs, and finance. And these can be comprised of all board members or they may be comprised of non-board members. There are certain committees that make more sense than others to include other folks from outside the board of directors in those committees. I think communications and marketing and resource development and fundraising are always really great places to plug in members of the community who are not on the board. It lets them give back to the organization. It lets you kind of test them out because maybe you'll want them to be board members in the future. And you can utilize their skills in their area of expertise to help kind of supplement what you already have, the skills and expertise that you already have within your organization. But within that, these committees, if you've determined, for example, here, that you're going to develop a monthly donor program, say you don't have a director of development, or like Anita, say you want the development committee to be responsible for developing that monthly donor program. Then that committee is going to meet. It might take them, 1 special meeting. It might take 2 special meetings to put together their action plan for how they're going to do that. So you still might have the same goals, but the committee is going to be responsible for figuring out what those objectives are and what the timeline is for each of those. And it's a great way to create board and committee buy-in into the strategic planning process. And then lastly, and I'm going to go through this one because it's short and then we'll stop and have our final Q&A, is around monitoring progress. So this is the last phase. You have your action plan, you figured it out, you've got your strategic plan. This is not a static document that lives on a shelf. It's intended to be a guiding document. So you want to ensure that all your activities and your programs are mission aligned. And that way, when another organization comes to you and says, hey, I have a great idea, or a funder comes to you and says, hey, we have a lot of money that your organization is eligible for, but it's only for this purpose, you can decide whether that grant is a good fit for you, whether that program is a good fit for you. Is it mission aligned? Is it in your strategic plan? As you're taking that document, you want to ensure that those priorities, the goals, the actions, they're incorporated into all of your programs, right? You've identified what you want to do with those programs. So what does that look like in your day-to-day implementation of the programs? And who's responsible for those programs? Building those tasks into the individual work plans. And then, of course, into your organizational budget. a lot of times within that plan, if you want to increase capacity to grow your programs, you're going to need to increase your staff. You might have to purchase tools and technology, and you might have to grow your resources to be able to make those significant expenditures. So writing into your budget what type of resources you need coming in, philanthropic resources, government resources, individual giving. What do you need and how are you going to use those funds that are in line with your strategic plan? And then you want to utilize their evaluative metrics to regularly review your performance. So you can use a simple Excel tool if you created, as I said, that action template that you could go back to it and say, okay, it's Q1. How far along are we? We said we're going to do this in Q2. And that's a simple way, an easy way to do it is using an Excel. Or if you're a little more advanced, or if you just really like to use technology, there are project management tools that you can use that you can plug in all those goals and objectives and timelines, and you can track them. How close are you to reaching those goals? You can upload documents related to those goals. You can send, reminder emails and put things on people's calendar if you've ever used project management tools. And Monday.com, I have a client that's using this right now. Monday.com is a free resource for nonprofits. And it's a project management tool that you can use. So that might be something you want to consider plugging in all of your metrics into there. And then you want to find ways to refer back to your strategic plan regularly. You might want to have a specific meeting that you have on a regular basis. Hey, every 2 months, our strategic planning committee is going to meet to review, or quarterly, we're going to meet to review where we are in relation to our strategic planning goals. You can reference the strategic plan or parts of the strategic plan at your board meetings, at committee meetings, maybe especially if your committee has put together their action plan. At their next committee meeting, they can use that action plan to kind of build the agenda for that committee meeting. And of course, at your staff meetings as well. So those are just some ways that we can sort of ensure that we are aligned with the goals and priorities that we've established for ourselves and checking in on a regular basis. And that is all I have for you today. But I'll open it up to questions. I think I'll start, Kelsey, if there are any that are already in the chat, we can answer those. And then if there's any time, folks can come off mute.
Great. We had one from the previous section while we wait to see if there are any others, which was, can the mission or vision change?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You should reevaluate every single time that you go through a strategic planning process. You should reevaluate your mission. And again, that should be about every 3 years. That does not mean that your mission is going to change every 3 years, but you should review it, read it, do it after you've done the SWOT analysis, after you've looked at your context, because that's going to help you decide based on where we think we're going, is this mission still serving us? But yes, it absolutely can change. It absolutely should change. There are some organizations that have the same mission for 20 years and then decide, we need to tweak this or we need to change it completely. And you see that a lot with organizations when they go through a rebranding process. So yes, your mission can change. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat box or feel free to come off mute and ask your questions.
We have another one. What is the best way to reach Lavin strategies for a possible consult?
Oh, good question. I, this is how. This is me. This is my email. This is my cell phone, my website. So feel free. I'm also on LinkedIn. And I would love if you would all connect with me on LinkedIn. I try to, I'm very active on LinkedIn. Anything else? All right. Well, it's been a
Hold on, Emily.
pleasure.
Sorry, we have another.
Okay.
We use board source in my nonprofit management class extensively. Are there any other resources that you recommend?
Oh gosh. Yes. I mean, there are a lot of great resources out there. A few that I like that I subscribe to, just nonprofit, a few nonprofit resources that I subscribe to are there's one that's called Avocado. They have just such great articles. You can follow them on LinkedIn as well. But I love getting their emails delivered directly to my inbox. Um, there are some others. I think what I'll do, I can even put together kind of a resource list because I'm not in that space right now. I feel like I'm not thinking of all of them that are available. But there are a few great resources that will deliver regular newsletters to your inbox that have free trainings on a regular basis. Um, so I will, what I'll do is actually send a list that can be included as kind of a companion piece to this session.
Great. We had another question here, which was if strategic planning occurs ideally every 3 years, where and how does forward planning, one, two, you like the first year, the second year, et cetera, where does that plan come into play?
Um, I'm not I'm going to try to answer this question the way that I'm hearing it, but please jump in if I'm not answering this in the way it was intended. So, when you're doing a 3-year strategic planning process, that's why the vision is so important, right? You're setting your vision, you're figuring out, what your mission is, how you do the work that you do, and what are your priorities for the next 3 years. Once you get all those priorities up there, what those 15 or 20 priorities up there, I usually like to just kind of star the ones that are the most immediate, and then they might be in different buckets. So you might have a capacity building priority that is going to be a year one priority, or even like a Q2 of year one priority, right? And you might have, one or two programmatic priorities that are going to be high level priorities. And when you go through your action planning, you just want to make sure that to the extent that you can, and it's not a perfect system, right? Which is why you really need that decision making framework, that you're identifying when this needs to happen. This needs to happen in Q2 of this year. This needs to happen in Q1 of next year. And I always do, this needs to happen by, not this needs to happen exactly when, but at the very least, we want to make sure that this is done by Q2 of 2026. So you want to do some timeline planning. Your priorities are your 3-year priorities. And that's the importance of getting into that action planning, is to figure out how important are those priorities? How timely are those priorities? When do you think you can actually achieve them? Anything else?
I don't see any more questions coming through. If anyone has anything, you
I
can.
did, excuse me, Kelsey, I did see that there was a question about when are the Rock Rose grant acceptance dates?
Yes, I was just messaging.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, were you going to answer that one, Kelsey, or did
Oh,
you want me to?
sure. I was typing it up right now to put in the chat, but September will be the opening of our cycle for 2025 for funding in 2026. So if you follow us on social media or you're on our mailing list, you'll get those updates.
Excellent. Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much for sharing all of this great information. And thank you, everybody, for coming to this workshop. It's exciting for Rock Rose to be able to get information out into the community like this. So thanks again for everybody for being here, and Emily for sharing your expertise with us.